On the morning of December 7, 1941, 3 PT boat squadrons were in the United States when Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Navy Lieutenant Commander led Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 1. Some of William C. Speck's boats stationed in Pearl Harbor fired at the attackers. Lieutenant Commander led Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 2 to strengthen defenses at the Panama Canal. Earl S. Caldwell was at the New York Navy Yard, finishing work on 11 boats that would be placed on the aircraft ferry ships Hammond Sport and Kitty Hawk. They departed New York 10 days later. Nearly a year passed before they faced the enemy, standing night after night against the powerful Tokyo Express at Guadalcanal, hoping desperately for success. On September 28, 6 boats from Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, under the command of Lieutenant John D. Bulkley, reached Manila Bay. The officers and crew of Squadron 3 fought bravely against the enemy for 4 difficult months during the defense of the Philippines. Eventually, the boats could no longer continue the fight. Before the war escalated in the United States, the Navy's PT boats were largely unknown. No standard strategy had been established for their use, and they had never been tested in battle. However, Rear Admiral Francis D. Rockwell, commandant of the 16th Naval District, wrote in January 1942 that the boats had proven their worth. They had sunk 2 ships between 3,000 and 5,000 tons, along with 3 landing boats. The Navy recognized their value and built more. On December 7, 1941, there were 29 PT boats. By December 7, 1943, there were more than 29 squadrons. At Guadalcanal, the Tokyo Express encountered PT boats in the Upper Solomons and along the coast of New Guinea. These boats cut off enemy barge supply routes, defeated German E-boats in gunnery battles in the English Channel, and torpedoed German cargo ships in the Mediterranean. They also helped stop deadly kamikaze attacks at Mindoro and played a role in defeating Japanese forces at the Battle of Surigao Strait. Under the cover of darkness, they secretly landed scouts, agents, and reconnaissance teams in France, Italy, the Solomons, New Guinea, and the Philippines. Unlike other surface ships, PT boats engaged the enemy frequently and at close range. Their specialty was nearshore attacks, where they managed to inflict damage on the enemy while sustaining minimal losses. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the Wire 20, a covered barge used as a squadron tender, was moored at the Pearl Harbor submarine base. PT boats 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, and 25 were tied in pairs beside it. The crews were having breakfast on the barge when the attack began. The squadron's duty officer, standing near the edge of the barge, noticed aircraft flying over Ford Island. He watched as they dove toward Battleship Row and Ford Island itself. At the same time, 4 things happened. A senior petty officer beside him said, "They look like Japs." He recognized the Japanese insignia on the plane's wingtips. The first bomb exploded, and he rushed into the mess hall, shouting a gas alarm. At that time, PT boats were lightly armed, carrying only 2 sets of 50 caliber machine guns in powered turrets. Within seconds, all guns were firing. 2 crew members, GM-1C Joy Van Zilla and TM-1C George B. Huffman, were on the deck of PT-23 when the attack began. They quickly manned the turrets and claimed the first enemy hit when a low-flying plane with a torpedo burst into flames near Ford Island. Another torpedo plane flying over Magazine Point was also hit and crashed near the submarine base. Meanwhile, 6 squadron boats were being loaded onto the oiler U.S. Ramapo to be transported to the Philippines. PTs 27, 29, 30, and 42 were on cradles on Ramapo's deck, while PTs 26 and 28 were positioned under a massive hammerhead crane on the dock, waiting to be lifted onto the ship. To reduce fire risk, the PT boats had carbon dioxide blankets over their gasoline tanks. Since the crews couldn't start the gasoline engines, they quickly cut the hydraulic lines, releasing the pressure and allowing the power turrets to function manually. Each machine gun, operated by a 4-man crew, opened fire, while the Ramapo's guns joined in. The PT boats on the dock were uncomfortably close to the ship's firing guns, but they kept shooting. A bomb exploded near the Ramapo's port bow, between the heavy cruiser U.S. New Orleans and the repair ship U.S. Rigel. The PT boats fired over 4,000 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition. Though they seemed to hit enemy aircraft, so many ships were firing that it was impossible to confirm specific hits. The 6 PT boats aboard the Ramapo were supposed to be delivered to Manila Bay and transferred to Squadron 3. However, the Japanese attacked the Philippines so quickly and with such force that shipping anything into Manila Bay became impossible. The boats were returned to Pearl Harbor, leaving Squadron 3 with only 6 vessels, PTs 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, and 41. When the Japanese launched their first major air attack on Manila Bay on December 10, the PT boats, stationed at the Cavite Navy Yard, went into action. That day, the air raid warning system worked well, allowing the boats time to move freely in Manila Bay. At 12:40 p.m., the first Japanese planes bombed Nichols Field. Then, a wave of about 35 planes attacked ships in the bay. The PT boats, armed with .50 caliber machine guns and single-mounted .30 caliber Lewis guns, were unable to hit the high-altitude bombers flying at 20,000 feet. Later, 5 enemy bombers separated from the main group and deliberately targeted the PT boats. Theoretically, a PT boat could avoid bombs by turning sharply just as the attacking plane reached its release point. The theory proved correct. No bombs hit their targets. PT-31 and PT-35 reported shooting down 2 and 1 aircraft, respectively. At 1:14 p.m., the first bomb struck the Navy Yard. Over the next hour, 3 waves of 27 bombers each flew overhead, dropping bombs at will. The Navy Yard's power plant, dispensary, torpedo repair shop, supply office, warehouses, signal station, commissary, barracks, and officer quarters were all hit. Several ships, tugs, and barges along the shore were also damaged. Nearly every bomb landed within the Navy Yard, setting 1/3 of Cavite City and the entire yard on fire. The PT boats could not outrun the bombers, but they could maneuver effectively. However, they suffered losses. Most of their spare parts and equipment were destroyed. The only surviving spare engines were the 9 that John Bulkley had wisely stored in private garages in Manila. 3 of those were lost when the Japanese took Manila on January 2. Of the 6 sent to Corregidor, 2 were destroyed during a bombing on January 9. When the squadron retreated in March, the last 4 had to be abandoned on Corregidor. Just as damaging as the loss of spare parts was the destruction of thousands of drums of 100-octane gasoline. With the Navy Yard devastated, all remaining facilities had to be moved and spread out in preparation for future attacks. On the afternoon of December 10, after helping transport the wounded from the Navy Yard to a hospital, Squadron 3 relocated to Sisseman Bay, a small cove near Marival's Harbor on the southern tip of the Bataan Peninsula. The first few weeks at Sisseman Bay were bleak. The squadron occupied a few native nipa huts and a small fishing wharf, awaiting their next orders. John Bully went to headquarters each morning to receive orders for the following night's operations. The boats carry out routine patrols along the Batangas Peninsula, extending south to Verde Island and north along the Bataan coast near Manila Bay. According to standard procedures, PT boats were supposed to patrol in pairs or groups of 3 to provide backup in case one encountered trouble. However, due to a limited number of boats, spare parts, and fuel, it was often only possible to send out 1 PT boat at a time. A small patrol boat such as the Fishery Z, the Perry, or the Moran would frequently accompany a PT boat. Occasionally, one of the 2 4-stack destroyers, the Pillsbury and the Peary, would also provide support until they left the area. As the Japanese tightened their control and incorrect sighting reports became more frequent along the Bataan coast, many PT searches turned up nothing. Maintaining the PT boats required constant effort. Repairs were carried out using the dry dock Dewey, which lifted each boat in turn, and the outdated submarine tender Canopus, which was anchored at Marival's and performed impressive repairs using limited resources. An accidental explosion in the engine compartment of PT-32 put it out of action for weeks. By December, most of the Asiatic fleet had moved south. Since the Japanese controlled the skies, they bombed Manila at will. On December 21, Rear Admiral Rockwell moved his headquarters to Corregidor, at Admiral Thomas Sears' headquarters in the Marsman Building in Manila. Rockwell held his last meeting with the commander of the Asiatic Fleet 3 days later. During the meeting, the Marshman building was bombed 3 times. After learning that Admiral Hart was heading south to join the main fleet, Rockwell took command of all naval forces in the Manila region. When he returned to Corregidor that night, he found that American High Commissioner Francis Barrer, Philippine President Manuel Quezon, and General Douglas MacArthur had also relocated there. On Christmas Eve, Admiral Hart departed on the submarine Shark. As Manila was about to be declared an open city, Rockwell sent his assistant, Lieutenant Jim M. Chaplin, to ensure the city's oil and gas stocks were destroyed. With the help of oil company executives in Manila, Chaplin accomplished the task. Rockwell reported to General MacArthur on December 26. That same day, Japanese aircraft launched a major attack to destroy PT boats, gunboats, and the destroyers Pillsbury and Peary. Due to the increasing danger, fuel shortages, and lack of rest for the crew, Rockwell ordered the destroyers to head south on December 27. The next day, as Manila was declared an open city, he met with Captain John Wilkes, commander of the Asiatic Fleet's submarines. They agreed that it was no longer safe to operate out of Manila Bay. By the end of December, Wilkes and his submarines left, leaving the submarine rescue ship Pigeon and the tender Canopus to assist any submarines that entered the Manila area. At this point, Rockwell's remaining forces consisted of 5 tugs, 3 small patrol boats, 3 river gunboats, 3 old minesweepers, and the PT boats of Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3. Meanwhile, about 100 miles away, a convoy of 76 Japanese transport ships began unloading in Lingayen Gulf on December 22. The U.S. Army completed its withdrawal from Bataan Peninsula on December 31, and the Japanese entered Manila on January 2. On the night of December 17, a massive explosion shook Sisseman Cove. As the men of Squadron 3 looked out toward the entrance to Manila Bay, they saw many flashing lights on the water. Lieutenant Bulkley immediately sent PT-32, PT-34, and PT-35 into action. The sea was covered in oil, with survivors from the Corregidor, a Filipino ship evacuating civilians to Australia, struggling to stay afloat. The ship had taken a wrong route, hit a mine, and sunk almost immediately. The PT crews worked tirelessly to haul the wet, oil-covered survivors aboard using ladders and ropes. When they finally counted the rescued, they were shocked. Out of 296 passengers, all but 7 had survived. PT-32, a 77-foot boat designed for just 2 officers and 9 crew members, had managed to take 196 people aboard. On the night of December 24, PT-33 was patrolling south of Manila Bay alongside the Pillsbury when it ran aground on a coral reef 5 miles north of Cape Santiago. PT-31 and PT-41 tried 3 times on Christmas Day to pull PT-33 free but failed. With no other option, the crew stripped the boat of anything useful and set it on fire on December 26 to prevent it from falling into enemy hands. A lack of spare parts and poor quality fuel were rapidly deteriorating the PT boats. Their crews were exhausted from continuous patrols and emergency missions, and the boats were in poor condition. An entry in the war diary of the 16th Naval District on Christmas Day recorded that the PTs were suffering due to fuel shortages, difficult conditions, and the risk of being trapped in Manila Bay. The decision was made to stop patrolling Verde Island and instead use the remaining PT boats for dispatch missions and attacks on nearby enemy vessels. Still, the PTs continued to patrol the west coast of Bataan, often chasing false alarms. Squadron 3 also patrolled Manila Bay nightly until relieved by Army-controlled Philippine key boats, which were nearly identical to PT boats. The men faced worsening food shortages. As of December 16, all naval personnel were restricted to 2 meals a day, and both the quantity and quality of rations declined over time. The standard routine for shore-based personnel was to wake up at dawn, work until breakfast at 8 o'clock, continue working until dinner at 16 o'clock, and then resume work until dark. However, those on night patrols could not follow this schedule and had to put in extra effort to keep their boats combat ready. Another problem was the poor fuel quality. Lieutenant Bulkley reported that much of their oil and gasoline had been sabotaged. The fuel contained a waxy substance that clogged filters and carburetors, requiring constant cleaning. Engines became unreliable, sometimes cutting out unexpectedly. Eventually, with limited resources, the crews had to open the gas tanks and clean them thoroughly. To make matters worse, lubricating oil contained grit. Gasoline supplies were also running low due to multiple losses: the bombing of the Navy Yard, the destruction of Manila's fuel stocks, and the loss of gasoline drums at Sangley Point and Corregidor. On December 29, an enemy bomb completely destroyed one of Corregidor's two major fuel depots. By January 18, Admiral Rockwell's Chief of Staff, Captain Herbert J. Ray, had signed off on a new mission for Lieutenant Bulkley. Intelligence reported 4 enemy ships, including a large transport and a destroyer, near Banga Bay, 4 miles north of Myron. Bulkley was ordered to attack with 2 boats sometime between nightfall and dawn. In place of Squadron Executive Officer Lieutenant Robert B. Kelly, who was in the Corregidor Hospital with an infected finger, Bulkley led the mission himself. Lieutenant Bulkley was aboard PT-34, which was temporarily commanded by Baron W. Chandler, USNR, while PT-31 was under the command of Lieutenant Edward G. Dong. Upon reaching the mouth of Subic Bay at the northwest tip of the Bataan Peninsula, the 2 boats separated under the cover of night. PT-31 was instructed to avoid the eastern side of Subic and rendezvous with PT-34 at the entrance of Binanga Bay, a narrow inlet on the eastern side of Subic Bay. Entering Subic Bay half an hour after midnight, PT-34 was challenged by a light from Benetton Point, a mile off the port beam. The boat slowed from 18 knots to 10, cautiously advancing. Shortly after, gunfire erupted from the shore south of Binanga Bay, leading John Bulkley to suspect PT-31 was under attack. As PT-34 moved further, a small vessel flashed a challenge signal. The boat altered course toward it, but, unable to see it clearly, veered east to meet PT-31. More lights flashed from Grande Island a mile to the north and from Ilinan Point, just south of Binanga Bay. Machine gunfire erupted from Ilinan Point. PT-31 did not arrive at the rendezvous, leaving PT-34 waiting in Subic Bay. Half an hour later, PT-34 ventured alone into Binanga Bay. About 500 yards inside, a 2-masted freighter loomed ahead. The ship issued a challenge, and PT-34 responded by firing 2 torpedoes. One malfunctioned, but the other detonated in under a minute. As the boat retreated at full speed, the crew observed a fire followed by 2 large explosions in Port Binanga. Shore batteries opened fire, and the crew focused on dealing with the malfunctioning torpedo. Stopping a hot-run torpedo required closing a valve in the airline to the torpedo's combustion pot, a task fraught with danger. The torpedo's turbines could disintegrate, sending white-hot metal fragments flying. John Martino, CTM, quickly acted to stop the hot run, but was left with a still dangerous torpedo hanging from the tube. With rough seas washing over the warhead, it risked detonation with even minor force. Martino jammed a wad of toilet paper into the impeller blades to prevent further activation. 4 hours later, the torpedo dislodged harmlessly into the sea. Lieutenant Bulkley reported to Admiral Rockwell the following morning that his crew had struck a ship in Binanga Bay. Army observers stationed on Marival's Mountain, using 20-power binoculars, claimed to have seen the ship sink. It was believed to be a 5,000-ton merchant vessel armed with 5.5-inch guns that had been shelling U.S. Army positions in western Bataan. However, post-war Japanese records did not confirm this sinking. Bulkley also reported that PT-31 had not made contact and had failed to return. Lieutenant Dong had attempted to free PT-31 by walking out an anchor and making multiple attempts to back the boat off the reef. After 3 hours, the reverse gears burned out, and the boat remained stranded. He ordered the crew to abandon ship. PT-31 had barely begun its patrol along Subic Bay's eastern shore when it suffered engine failures due to wax deposits clogging fuel strainers and airbound freshwater cooling systems. Stranded on the reef, Dong destroyed his boat by cutting holes in the fuel tanks, damaging the hull with grenades, and setting it ablaze before fleeing into the water. The crew fashioned a raft from the engine room canopy and mattresses, launching it into the sea. Ensign William H. Plant, USNR, led 11 crew members on the raft, while Lieutenant Dong searched for them after setting fire to PT-31. After an hour and a half, he found footprints leading to a group of 9 men hiding in bushes. Plant and 2 others, Rudolph Ballo and William R. Dine, were never seen again. Japanese planes patrolled overhead while infantry attacked to the south near the settlement of Moron. That morning, Lieutenant Dong observed Japanese artillery fire moving northward and suspected they were retreating. By 1500, he planned to reach friendly lines along the beach at night. As a backup, he considered using native boats or bankas to travel by night into Subic Bay. Dong and his men located 2 bankas and stripped barbed wire to use for rigging sails. However, by late afternoon, Japanese forces had moved closer, and Dong abandoned the idea of a land escape. At 1700, scouts confirmed the bankas were in good condition but needed modifications. From their vantage point, the men spotted what appeared to be 2 light armored vehicles approaching. Under cover of darkness, they moved to the bankas and pushed off at 2000, staying close to shore. At approximately 2100, both bankas capsized, causing the loss of most equipment. After righting the boats, they continued cautiously. A strong headwind near Napo Point forced them to alter course, exhausting the crew. By 300, Dong decided to attempt a landing. They beached near Napo Point, but became entangled in barbed wire against the cliffside. Stranded until dawn, they were eventually rescued by Philippine Army forces, who provided food, water, and transportation back to Mariveles, arriving by 1730 on January 20, 1942. Meanwhile, other naval operations continued. That evening, PT-41 reconnoitered the south side of Manila Bay near Ternate, where Japanese forces were believed to have stationed heavy guns. George E. Cox, Jr., USNR, commanded the mission aboard PT-41. The boat strafed multiple Japanese infantry positions along the beach 2 miles east of Ternate, but found no evidence of heavy artillery. Army reports later confirmed 8 enemy soldiers were killed and at least 14 wounded in the attack. Lieutenant Bulkley reunited with Chandler aboard PT-34 4 nights later, on January 22-23. A 40-foot landing barge was sunk by PT-34 north of Canis Point, while the boat sustained 14 hits from intense small-caliber return fire. Vincent Chandler was wounded when a single .25 caliber bullet pierced both his ankles, as well as the plywood and aluminum cockpit. It wasn't until daybreak that PT-34 managed to navigate back through the minefield. The crew could only administer first aid to Chandler and continue their patrol. Meanwhile, soldiers on shore had difficulty distinguishing between enemy landing boats and PTs, leading them to open fire with 3-inch and machine guns to prevent an attempt to investigate Subic Bay to the north. The crew of PT-34 spotted another landing barge off Luzon Point. As they moved south, the boat approached, suppressing return fire and closing the range. Blee then boarded the barge and, according to official reports, retrieved documents, dispatch cases, and equipment for examination. 2 wounded Japanese soldiers, including an officer, surrendered on their knees and were taken aboard PT-34 as prisoners of war, while a third, already deceased, was left behind as the launch sank. The squadron commander was still on board the sinking launch while rescuing the wounded men, who were too weak to swim. When the rock fell on May 6, 1942, Ensign Chandler was transferred to a hospital in Corregidor, where he was captured. Over 2.5 years later, when U.S. forces returned to the Philippines, he was freed. That same evening, Bulkley and Dong returned to Subic Bay, transporting only 1 boat, PT-41, due to a fuel shortage. They spotted what seemed to be an anchored transport between 4,000 and 6,000 tons, featuring a streamlined bridge and a relatively small stack. It was located in a cove near Sample Point, just west of the bay entrance. PT-41 closed to 800 yards, with Cox at the helm and Dong operating the torpedo director. They fired 1 torpedo, then continued forward another 300 yards under heavy fire before launching a second. The first torpedo struck midship, while the second malfunctioned, its tail striking the deck upon exiting the tube. Debris rained down around PT-41, and the crew watched as the explosion unfolded. A shore battery with 4 to 6 3-inch guns opened fire as the PT boat strafed the transport while making a sharp left turn. The 41 maneuvered at full speed, zigzagging out to sea and barely avoiding a 20-yard obstacle net that could have trapped it like an insect in a web. Meanwhile, PT-32, with a top speed of 22 knots and held together by a makeshift rig of wires and bracing, was assigned to continue night patrols. On the night of February 1, PT-32 was deployed on coastal patrol along Bataan, under the command of Lieutenant J. Vincent Schumacher, with Lieutenant Dong aboard as the officer in tactical command. Around 21:30, a large vessel resembling a cruiser was spotted 5,000 yards to the north. The PT boat struggled to close the distance at only 22 knots. The ship withdrew steadily toward Subic Bay for 30 minutes before slowing and turning east toward the Bataan coastline. PT-32 moved in quickly, but as it was illuminated by the cruiser's searchlight at 5,000 yards, the enemy fired a 2-gun volley. Schumacher identified the shells as 6-inch rounds, which detonated in the water 500 yards ahead. PT-32 fired a starboard torpedo, then launched its port torpedo and retreated at maximum speed of approximately 25 knots. For 2 minutes, gun salvos continued dropping around the PT boat. Schumacher reported witnessing an explosion near the enemy's searchlight, followed by debris appearing in the beam. There was a brief pause in firing, and the ship seemed to slow as the distance between them increased. This suggested that the second torpedo had struck, causing the vessel to reduce speed to about 15 knots. Fire resumed but was less accurate, and PT-32 eventually evaded the searchlight around 22:30. While no Japanese ship was officially reported sunk, Japanese records later revealed that the Manolayer Yayama suffered minor damage in Subic Bay on February 1. Although shore fire was cited as the cause, PT-32's attack may have been responsible. On the night of February 17, John Bulkley made another entry into Subic Bay, this time aboard PT-35 under Ensign Baker's command. This marked the final operation of Squadron 3 in the Manila area. PT-41 followed PT-35 to the bay entrance, waiting at a safe distance in case an enemy destroyer was present. If necessary, PT-41 would attempt to lure the destroyer into its line of fire. PT-35 fired a torpedo at a small vessel, likely a 200 to 400-ton trawler, near the entrance by Grande Island. However, the torpedo seemed to pass beneath the ship without exploding. Another, larger vessel was spotted at a Longapo pier deeper in the bay. PT-35 launched a long-range torpedo before quickly withdrawing, strafing the beach to target enemy gun positions that had previously fired upon them. No explosion was heard or seen from the torpedo. On March 4, General MacArthur received orders to evacuate Corregidor. He offered to take Admiral Rockwell and select staff members with him, informing them that a submarine was available for transport. A few days later, Admiral Rockwell and his Chief of Staff, Captain Ray, were ordered to accompany him. The original plan was to use PT boats to assist with the submarine portion of the escape. The U.S. permit was scheduled to arrive in Corregidor on March 14 to pick up the group and depart. However, by early March, radio broadcasts had announced that MacArthur would assume command of all Allied forces in Australia. Enemy ship activity, particularly mine layers near Subic Bay, increased significantly on March 9. Reports indicated heightened enemy surface patrols in the southern Philippines, and a destroyer division was seen moving north. The Japanese Navy anticipated MacArthur's escape attempt and intensified efforts to prevent it. Due to these threats, the plan shifted. Rather than waiting for the submarine, MacArthur would leave by PT boat as soon as preparations were complete. On March 10, Lieutenant Bulkley received direct orders from Admiral Rockwell. Bulkley was to arrive at Corregidor's North Dock at 19:30 the next evening to pick up General MacArthur, his wife, their son, and MacArthur's Chief of Staff, Major General Richard K. Sutherland. Lieutenant Kelly, commanding PT-34 and Ensign Baker's, commanding PT-35, would remain in Sisseman Cove to avoid attracting enemy attention. Once MacArthur's group boarded, these boats would transport them away. Admiral Rockwell and Captain Ray would be on PT-34. At 1915, PT-32, commanded by Lieutenant Schumacher, was scheduled to collect passengers at Quarantine Dock in Mariveles. All boats were to rendezvous at the entrance to Manila Bay by 20 o'clock and travel south together, reaching Tagawayan Island by 7:30 on March 12. To mislead enemy forces, Philippine motorboats were ordered to conduct diversionary operations off Subic Bay that evening. If any PT boat experienced mechanical failure, it was to transfer passengers to another vessel and continue alone or, if necessary, be scuttled. During daylight hours, the boats would remain hidden in Tagawayan's lee before departing for Cagayan, Mindanao, at 17 o'clock on March 12, with an expected arrival by 7 o'clock on March 13. The mission prioritized avoiding enemy encounters. But if discovered, PT-41 carrying MacArthur was to escape while the others engaged the attackers. Alternative rendezvous points and hideouts were designated in case any boat failed to reach Tagawayan or Cagayan as planned. The permit was assigned to inspect Tagawan Island at dawn on March 13 as a final precaution. It was to prepare for taking passengers on board if any signs were detected. Just before departure, an air reconnaissance report indicated the presence of a cruiser and a destroyer southwest of Muro and in Apo East Pass, west of Muro. As scheduled, the boats left Manila Bay in a column, led by the 41. While heading southwest toward the island, they gave Capper Island a wider berth than initially intended due to numerous white lights flashing from the shore. The boats had to stay close to the western side of Mindo Strait due to reports of enemy vessels. Strong easterly winds sent sheets of water over the bows, lashing the helmsmen's faces. From the outset, maintaining formation proved challenging. After 3 months of continuous service without spare parts or maintenance, the boats were in poor condition, and the 32 had never been fully repaired. Kelly, aboard the 34, noticed he was falling behind the 41. To maximize speed, he instructed his engine room to secure the throttles. Bulkley, leading the 41, ordered the others to slow down so the 34 could catch up. Unexpectedly, Kelly overtook the lead boat before the command to slow down could be executed. Before night ended, the boats separated. PT-32 was forced to run on only 2 engines while clearing its gasoline strainers. Other boats had to halt at times. As dawn broke, Schumacher spotted what he believed was a destroyer trailing him. To gain speed, he jettisoned his deckload of gasoline, but the supposed destroyer continued to approach. Preparing for a last torpedo attempt, he realized in the dim morning light that he had mistaken PT-41 for an enemy ship. 2 hours behind schedule, Kelly's PT-34 reached Tagawan at 9:30 a.m. He and his passengers endured a tense day. PT-41 and PT-32, after hiding on nearby islands to avoid air attacks, did not enter the cove until late afternoon. PT-35 was still missing. PT-32 was in no condition to continue to Cagayan. The boats refueled using the deck drums at Tagawan, but the 32 had lost its supply. Additionally, the yacht was leaking due to loose struts, and only one of its 3 engines was functional. The 32's passengers were distributed among the other boats. After awaiting the permit and PT-35 and issuing instructions, Schumacher was ordered to reach Leo on Payne Island for refueling and attempt to continue to Cagayan. At 1800, PT-34 led the 2 remaining boats. An hour later, Admiral Rockwell reported sighting a Japanese cruiser to the northeast, but they changed course and avoided detection in the sunset's glare. As night fell, they crossed the traffic lane and navigated along the coast of Negros Island, staying as close to shore as safety allowed. Navigation was imprecise, but they reached Selenino Island at 200, setting course for Cagayan. The weather deteriorated between 100 and dawn, with heavy seas and frequent rain squalls. However, they likely benefited from this poor visibility while crossing the most dangerous patrol zones. On the morning of March 13, both crews and passengers reached Cagayan, exhausted and drenched. They had traveled 560 miles through enemy-patrolled waters, arriving precisely on schedule. PT-35, the third of the original 4 boats, arrived later that day. However, the B-7 aircraft intended to transport them from Mindanao to Australia arrived 4 days late, and only 2 of the 3 promised planes were available. Leaving all luggage behind, the passengers managed to board the 2 aircraft. Shortly after midnight on March 17, the heavily loaded planes departed for Australia, where General MacArthur would begin assembling forces to reclaim the Philippines. Lieutenant Bowley was instructed to hide his boats near Con and target enemy shipping as long as they remained operational. Initially, he was concerned about the missing PT-32 and spent his first week on Mindanao, searching nearby beaches by air. It was weeks before he learned its fate. By the time the permit reached Tagwan on March 13, Schumacher determined PT-32 was unseaworthy. He and his crew boarded the submarine, which then destroyed PT-32. The vessel had 2 engines out of commission, and the third was unreliable due to seawater leakage. The previously patched deck was cracked and leaking heavily from the strain of carrying 1,000 gallons of fuel. The center shaft's tail strut bolts had sheared off, rendering it inoperable and causing further leaks. The only available spare magneto was defective. Given the vessel's poor condition, the rough seas, and the likelihood of the final engine failing, making it safely to paying was deemed unlikely. To ensure crew safety, assistance was requested from the U.S. permit, and PT-32 was destroyed. On February 20, Commonwealth President Manuel Quezon, his wife, son, 2 daughters, and staff left Corregidor aboard the submarine Swordfish. 2 days later, they landed on Payne's lower coast. The president later moved to the island of Negros, but had to relocate again within a month due to Japanese encirclement. The Army arranged for PT boats to transport him and his family from Negros to Mindanao for a flight to Australia. Only PT-35 and PT-41 remained operational after Kelly's PT-34 ran aground on Coral, damaging its propellers, struts, shafts, and anchor shackle. To meet the president's party at Zamboanguita on Negros' southern tip, PT-41, commanded by Bulkley, departed Cagayan at 1900 on March 18, followed by Akers on PT-35. Although the journey was only 100 miles, it was perilous. Army aerial reconnaissance reported 7 enemy destroyers patrolling southern Negros. The boats split near Apo Island, with PT-35 patrolling offshore against potential enemy surprises, while PT-41 proceeded to Zamboanguita. Bulkley waited at the dock for an hour, but no one arrived. Finally, Major Soriano, President Quezon's advisor, instructed them to proceed to Dumaguete, 15 miles up the coast. PT-41 was the only boat able to continue. PT-35 had sustained a large hole in its bow after hitting a submerged object. Despite bailing efforts, water overtook the boat. Akers took PT-35's crew aboard and navigated to Zamboanguita. PT-41, towing the crippled boat, released it to drift ashore. Upon reaching Dumaguete, the presidential party was still absent. Major Soriano then directed Bulkley 25 miles farther to Bataan, where President Quezon had received a telegram from General Wainwright, warning the journey was too dangerous due to Japanese warships. However, after speaking with Bulkley, Quezon reconsidered and decided to proceed. With a full load, PT-41 departed Dumaguete at 3:20, carrying President and Mrs. Quezon, their 2 daughters, Vice President Sergio Osmina, Major General Basilio Valdez, Major Soriano, 9 cabinet members, and extensive luggage in addition to its crew and PT-35's crew. Though the distance to Oroquieta on Mindanao was only 60 miles, the waters were rough. A large wave dislodged 2 torpedoes halfway out of their tubes, triggering hot runs. Sheets of water crashing over the bow likely shorted out the electric firing circuits. The torpedoes' afterbodies glowed red-hot as they spun uncontrollably.